The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valdoria Palace as Crown Prince Alexander paced furiously in his private study. His boots echoed against the polished stone, each step matching the thunderous beating of his heart. The ornate golden walls, adorned with portraits of his ancestors, seemed to close in around him as he processed the devastating news that had just reached his ears. Queen Regent Isabel, his stepmother, who had married his father King Edmund 5 years after his mother's death, sat rigidly in the velvet armchair near the window. Her usually pristine appearance was disheveled, her silver hair escaping from its elaborate updo, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a delicate porcelain teacup. The morning light revealed the exhaustion etched across her face, but also something else entirely: fear. Princess Elena, Alexander's beloved wife of 3 years, had not returned to the palace the previous evening. What had initially been dismissed as a delayed return from her charitable visit to the eastern provinces had now transformed into something far more sinister. The royal guards had found her carriage abandoned on the mountain pass, her personal belongings scattered across the rocky ground, and most disturbing of all, signs of a violent struggle. Alexander stopped his pacing and turned sharply toward Isabel, his blue eyes blazing with an intensity that made her shrink back into her chair. The prince had always been known for his composed demeanor, his diplomatic approach to conflicts, and his unwavering dedication to both his family and his future subjects. But today, all of that careful restraint had vanished, replaced by raw fury and desperation. "You knew." Alexander's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You knew exactly what would happen when you sent Elena on that route. You knew about the bandits in those mountains, about the political unrest in the eastern territories, about everything." Isabel's cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down with shaking hands. Her green eyes, once warm and maternal toward Alexander, now held a coldness that chilled him to his core. She had been like a mother to him after his own mother's tragic death in a riding accident, guiding him through his adolescence and early years as heir to the throne. But now, looking at her, Alexander saw a stranger. "Alexander, you must understand," Isabel began, her voice barely above a whisper. "The kingdom is changing. The old ways, the old alliances, they no longer serve us. Elena's influence over you, her progressive ideas about land reform and peasant rights, they threaten everything we've built." The prince felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath his feet. The woman he had trusted, who had held him when he wept for his deceased mother, who had celebrated his wedding to Elena with apparent joy, was now revealing herself as something entirely different. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he gripped the edge of his mahogany desk to steady himself. Her influence? Alexander's voice rose, no longer controlled. Elena's compassion for our people, her desire to create a more just kingdom. That's what you call harmful influence? She's tried to help the starving villages, to establish schools for commoner children, to ensure that our wealth reaches beyond these palace walls. Isabel stood slowly, her elaborate burgundy gown rustling as she moved toward the window overlooking the palace gardens. The gardens where Elena had spent countless hours planning her charitable initiatives, where she had laughed with the children of the palace staff, where she had dreamed of a better future for Valdoria. The irony was not lost on either of them. "You're naive, Alexander," Isabel said, her back still turned to him. "Elena's ideas would have bankrupted the crown within a decade. The noble families who support our reign would have turned against us. The delicate balance of power that has kept Valdoria stable for centuries would have crumbled." Alexander moved closer, his anger building with each word. The scent of Isabel's expensive perfume, once comforting and familiar, now made him nauseous. "So you arranged for her disappearance? You conspired against my wife, against the future queen of this kingdom?" Finally, Isabel turned to face him, and Alexander saw something in her expression that made his blood run cold. There was no remorse, no shame, only a calculating determination that spoke of careful planning and ruthless execution. This was not a moment of weakness or poor judgment, this was the revealing of a long-held agenda. "I arranged for her education," Isabel said calmly. "Elena needs to understand that her position comes with responsibilities she has been ignoring. The Eastern lords who took her are not common bandits, Alexander. They are loyal supporters of the crown, who believe, as I do, that she needs to learn her proper place. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece. Alexander stared at his stepmother, processing the full magnitude of her betrayal. Elena wasn't just missing, she was being held by conspirators working with the Queen Regent herself. The woman who had raised him, who had guided him toward the throne, had orchestrated the kidnapping of his wife. "You've made the greatest mistake of your life," Alexander said quietly, his voice now deadly calm. "Elena is not just my wife, she is the heart of this kingdom's future. She represents everything good and just that Valdoria could become, and you've betrayed not just her, but everything our family is supposed to stand for." Isabel's composure finally cracked slightly, and Alexander caught a glimpse of uncertainty in her eyes. Perhaps she had not anticipated the depth of his devotion to Elena, or the strength of his commitment to the progressive vision they shared. Perhaps she had underestimated how much the prince had changed since his marriage, how Elena's influence had not weakened him but made him stronger and more determined than ever. "The lords will release her once she agrees to abandon these foolish reforms," Isabel continued, but her voice lacked its previous conviction. "Once she understands that her role is to support traditional values, not to revolutionize them. This can all be resolved quietly, with no permanent damage done." Alexander walked to his desk and pulled out a sheet of royal parchment, his movements deliberate and controlled. As he began to write, Isabel watched nervously, suddenly realizing that her stepson was not responding as she had expected. She had anticipated anger, yes, but also eventual acceptance of the political realities she had presented. Instead, she was witnessing the emergence of a king she had never seen before. "You're right about one thing," Alexander said, as he continued writing. "This situation will be resolved, but not in the way you imagine." He signed the document with a flourish and turned to face her. "I'm formally stripping you of your position as Queen Regent, effective immediately. You'll be confined to your chambers while I personally lead the search for Elena. And when I find her and these lords you've conspired with, there will be consequences that you clearly haven't considered." Isabel's face went pale as the full implications of Alexander's words sank in. She had gambled everything on her ability to manipulate him, as she had when he was younger, but she had failed to account for how marriage and responsibility had transformed him. The young man who had once sought her approval and guidance was gone, replaced by a ruler who would not tolerate threats against those he loved. "You cannot do this," Isabel protested, but her voice betrayed her growing panic. "The noble families will not accept such drastic action. You need my support, my connections, my experience in managing the political complexities of the kingdom." Alexander moved to the door and opened it, revealing 2 palace guards waiting in the corridor. Their presence suggested that he had been planning this confrontation more carefully than Isabel had realized. Perhaps Elena's disappearance had been the final piece of evidence he needed to confirm suspicions that had been growing for months. "Escort the former Queen Regent to her chambers," Alexander instructed the guards. "She is not to leave or receive visitors without my express permission. And send word to Captain Marcus. I want every available man prepared to ride within the hour." As the guards moved toward Isabel, she made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. "Alexander, think carefully about what you're doing. Elena's fate depends on your cooperation with the Eastern Lords. If you take aggressive action against them, they may respond in ways that put her in greater danger." The prince paused at her words, and for a moment, Isabel thought she had found the leverage she needed. But when Alexander turned back to her, his expression was not one of fear or uncertainty, it was one of absolute resolve. "Elena's fate depends on my determination to protect her and the values we both believe in," he said firmly. "I won't abandon either her or our vision for Valdoria's future. And I won't allow fear of consequences to prevent me from doing what's right." As the guards escorted Isabel from the room, Alexander stood alone in his study, surrounded by the symbols of royal power that had once seemed so important. But now, all of that mattered far less than finding Elena and ensuring that their dream of a more just and compassionate kingdom could survive this betrayal. The prince moved to the window and looked out at the mountains in the distance, where his wife was being held by men who believed that tradition and power mattered more than justice and love. but they had underestimated both Elena's strength and his determination to protect her. The real battle for Valdoria's future was just beginning, and Alexander was ready to fight for everything that truly mattered. He picked up his sword from its place on the wall, the blade that had been passed down through generations of kings, and strapped it to his side. The weight of it felt different now, not like a ceremonial burden, but like a tool of justice that would help him reclaim his wife and reshape his kingdom according to the principles they both held dear. The eastern mountains of Valdoria rose like jagged teeth against the gray morning sky, as Prince Alexander led his cavalry through the treacherous mountain passes. Captain Marcus rode beside him, his weathered face grim with determination as they followed the trail left by Elena's captors. The sound of hoofbeats echoed off the rocky cliffs, creating an ominous rhythm that matched Alexander's growing anxiety about his wife's safety. 3 days had passed since the confrontation with Isabel. 3 days during which every hour felt like an eternity. The prince had assembled his most trusted guards and soldiers, men who had served his family for years and whose loyalty was beyond question. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a carefully laid trap. Meanwhile, in a fortified manor house hidden deep in the mountain valleys, Princess Elena sat in a cold stone chamber, her wrists bound with thick rope that had long since rubbed her skin raw. Her elegant traveling dress was torn and stained, her dark hair disheveled, but her spirit remained unbroken. Through the single barred window of her prison, she could see the distant peaks that separated her from Alexander and home. Lord Roderick Ashford, the eldest of the eastern nobles who had orchestrated her capture, entered the chamber carrying a tray of simple food and water. He was a man in his 60s, with gray hair and cold blue eyes that reflected a lifetime of political maneuvering. Unlike the common bandits Elena had initially suspected, Roderick carried himself with the bearing of nobility, making his betrayal all the more disturbing. "Your Highness," Roderick said with a mocking bow, "I trust you're beginning to understand the seriousness of your situation. Your husband has been making quite a stir in the capital, stripping Queen Isabel of her powers and threatening war against the eastern territories." Elena looked up at him with defiant eyes, refusing to show the fear that gnawed at her heart. "Alexander is a wise and just ruler. He won't be intimidated by kidnappers and traitors, no matter what titles they once held." Roderick set the tray down on the small wooden table and studied Elena carefully. "You speak of justice and wisdom, yet your own actions have threatened the very foundations of this kingdom. Your reforms would have destroyed the traditional structures that have kept Valdoria stable for centuries." Elena struggled to sit up straighter despite her bonds. "Those traditional structures have kept the majority of our people in poverty, while a small group of nobles hoarded wealth and power. The children in the eastern villages are starving while your manor houses overflow with luxury. That's not stability, that's injustice." The lord's expression hardened as Elena's words struck at the heart of his concerns. The princess had indeed been working to redistribute land and resources, to establish schools and hospitals that would serve commoners as well as nobility. These changes threatened the very system that had elevated families like the Ashfords to positions of power and privilege. "You understand nothing about governance," Roderick replied coldly. "Charitable feelings and good intentions cannot replace the wisdom of centuries. The common people need guidance and structure, not false promises of equality that will only lead to chaos and rebellion." Elena met his gaze steadily. "The common people need opportunity and dignity, not condescending lectures from those who have never experienced true hardship. Alexander and I have walked through those starving villages, have seen the children who work in dangerous conditions because they have no other choice, have spoken with families who cannot afford basic medical care. We haven't made our decisions based on theory, we've made them based on reality." As their conversation continued, Alexander and his men had reached the outer boundaries of the Ashford lands. The prince dismounted his horse and gathered his closest advisors around a large boulder that provided cover from potential observation. Captain Marcus unrolled a map of the region, pointing out the various estates and strongholds where Elena might be held. "The Ashford Manor is the most likely location," Marcus said quietly. "Lord Roderick has always been the most vocal opponent of Princess Elena's reforms, and his property is isolated enough to avoid detection. But approaching it will be dangerous. There are loyal guards throughout these mountains, and they'll have seen us coming from miles away." Sir Thomas, Alexander's childhood friend and most trusted knight, leaned forward to study the map. What if we divide our forces? A small group could approach directly while the main force creates a distraction elsewhere. If we can draw their attention away from the manor, we might be able to reach Princess Elena before they can move her again. Alexander considered the strategy, his mind racing through the possible outcomes. Every choice carried enormous risks, and Elena's life hung in the balance of decisions he was making without complete information. But doing nothing was not an option, and each passing hour increased the danger she faced. "There's another consideration," the prince said grimly. Isabel mentioned that the Eastern lords want Elena to abandon her reforms in exchange for her freedom. They're not planning to harm her physically, they're planning to break her spirit, to force her to renounce everything we've been working toward. Marcus nodded, understanding. Which means they'll keep her alive, but they'll also be prepared for negotiation. They might not expect a direct military assault. Alexander stood and looked toward the distant mountains where his wife was being held. The weight of command, of making decisions that would affect not only Elena's fate but the future of the kingdom, pressed down on him like a physical burden. But beneath the pressure was a burning determination that had been growing stronger since the moment he learned of Isabel's betrayal. "We're not here to negotiate," Alexander said firmly. "We're here to rescue my wife, and to demonstrate that threats against the royal family will not be tolerated. The Eastern lords have made their choice, and now they'll face the consequences." Back in her prison, Elena had managed to work one hand partially free from her bonds, though she kept this development hidden from her captors. As evening approached, she could hear increased activity in the manor house around her, guards moving through corridors, horses being prepared in the courtyard below, and hushed conversations that suggested something significant was approaching. Lord Roderick returned to her chamber as darkness fell, this time accompanied by two younger men who Elena recognized as his sons. The family resemblance was unmistakable, and their shared expression of grim determination suggested that they were preparing for something they viewed as unpleasant but necessary. "Your husband has rejected our reasonable offers of negotiation," Roderick announced. "Instead, he's chosen to approach our lands with an armed force, threatening violence against nobles who have served this kingdom faithfully for generations." Elena felt a surge of pride mixed with worry. Alexander was coming for her, as she had known he would, but she also knew that her captors would not surrender easily. The Ashford family had too much to lose, and they had already committed themselves too deeply to this course of action to retreat without a fight. "Alexander is protecting his wife and his kingdom," Elena replied. "You're the ones who chose violence when you decided to kidnap the future queen. You're the ones who chose treason when you conspired against the crown." The younger Ashford's son, Marcus, stepped forward angrily. "You call it treason to preserve the kingdom's traditions? Your reforms would have destroyed everything our family has built, everything we've contributed to Valdoria's greatness." Elena looked at him with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Your family has indeed built great wealth and influence, but you've built it on the backs of people who never had the chance to build anything for themselves. Alexander and I aren't trying to destroy greatness, we're trying to create a kingdom where greatness isn't reserved for those born into privilege." Lord Roderick silenced his son with a sharp gesture. "Philosophical debates will not resolve this situation. Your husband will be here within hours, and when he arrives, you will tell him that you have reconsidered your position on the reforms. You will publicly renounce your plans to redistribute land and resources, and you will agree to confine your future activities to traditional royal duties." Elena stood as tall as her bonds would allow, meeting Roderick's gaze with unwavering resolve. "I will never betray the people who need those reforms most. I will never abandon children who are starving while nobles feast in luxury, and I will never give you or anyone else the power to dictate what the future Queen of Valdoria can or cannot do." The standoff was interrupted by the sound of a horn echoing across the mountains, followed by the distant clash of metal on metal. Alexander's forces had engaged the outer guards of the Ashford estate, and the rescue attempt Elena had been hoping for was finally beginning. Roderick cursed under his breath and turned toward the window, where flickering lights in the distance suggested that battles were being fought at multiple locations across the mountain valley. Alexander had indeed divided his forces, and the Ashford defenders were being forced to respond to threats from several directions simultaneously. "Bring her," Roderick commanded his sons. "If Prince Alexander wants to play the role of conquering hero, we'll ensure that he understands the true cost of his choices." As the Ashford men prepared to move Elena to a more secure location, she felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. Alexander was coming for her, and she was ready to do whatever was necessary to help him succeed. The battle for Valdoria's future was being fought not just in the mountain valleys, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who would determine what kind of kingdom they wanted to create. The sound of fighting grew closer, and Elena could hear Alexander's voice in the distance, calling out commands to his men and demanding her safe return. Soon, she would be reunited with her husband, and together they would face whatever consequences arose from this night of violence and betrayal. But regardless of those consequences, Elena was certain of one thing: she would never surrender the vision of justice and compassion that had brought them to this moment. The clash of steel rang through the mountain air as Alexander's forces stormed the Ashford manor under cover of darkness. Torches blazed from the windows and battlements, casting dancing shadows across the courtyard, where royal guards fought desperately against the Eastern nobles' defenders. The prince himself led the charge toward the main building, his sword gleaming in the firelight as he cut through anyone who stood between him and Elena. Inside the manor's great hall, Lord Roderick held a dagger to Elena's throat as his sons barricaded the heavy wooden doors against Alexander's advancing soldiers. The princess stood perfectly still, her partially freed hands hidden behind her back as she worked to complete her escape from the ropes that bound her. She could hear Alexander's voice growing closer, calling out orders and demanding her safe return, and her heart raced with both hope and fear for his safety. "Your husband is more foolish than I anticipated," Roderick hissed in Elena's ear as the sound of splintering wood echoed through the hall. "Does he truly believe that military force can solve the political complexities of governing a kingdom?" Elena remained calm despite the blade at her throat, her voice steady and defiant. "Alexander believes that justice cannot be negotiated away, and that those who threaten innocent people must face consequences for their actions. You've taught him that diplomacy has its limits when dealing with men who have abandoned honor." The great doors finally gave way with a tremendous crash, and Alexander burst into the hall with Captain Marcus and a dozen loyal guards at his side. The prince's eyes immediately found Elena, and she saw the relief and fury warring in his expression as he took in her situation. His sword was drawn and ready, but he forced himself to remain still, knowing that any sudden movement might prompt Roderick to harm his wife. "Release her," Alexander commanded, his voice carrying the full authority of royal command. "Your quarrel is with me, not with Princess Elena. Let her go, and we'll settle this between men of honor." Lord Roderick laughed bitterly, pressing the dagger more firmly against Elena's neck. "Honor? You speak of honor while threatening to destroy the traditional foundations of this kingdom? Your wife's reforms would have bankrupted the noble families and created chaos among the common people who depend on our guidance." Alexander took a careful step forward, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. He could see the determination in her expression, the subtle signals she was sending him about the bonds she had been working to loosen. His wife was not helpless, and she was preparing to act when the moment was right. "The only chaos I see," Alexander replied, "is the chaos created by men who believe their comfort matters more than justice, who would rather kidnap and threaten than engage in honest dialogue about the future of our people." Elena felt the rope around her wrists finally give way completely, and she knew that her moment had come. But rather than immediately attempting to break free, she spoke directly to Lord Roderick, her voice carrying a compassion that surprised everyone in the room. "My lord," she said softly, "I understand your fear. Change is always frightening, especially when it threatens things we've come to rely upon. But the kingdom is already changing, with or without our reforms. The question is whether we guide that change toward justice and opportunity, or whether we resist it until it breaks everything apart." Roderick's grip on the dagger wavered slightly as Elena's words struck at concerns he had been suppressing. He had seen the growing unrest among the common people, the increasing difficulty of maintaining traditional systems in a world that was evolving rapidly around them. But admitting that change was necessary felt like surrendering everything his family had stood for across generations. "Pretty words," he said, though his voice lacked its previous conviction. "But you offer no guarantees that your reforms won't destroy the stability that has kept this kingdom strong. You ask us to gamble everything on idealistic theories that have never been tested." Elena turned slightly in Roderick's grip, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm not asking you to gamble everything. I'm asking you to help create something better. Your family's experience and knowledge could be invaluable in ensuring that reforms are implemented wisely and effectively. You could be part of building a stronger kingdom instead of fighting to preserve one that's already beginning to crumble." Alexander watched this exchange with growing understanding of why he had fallen in love with Elena and why her influence on the kingdom was so desperately needed. Even in this moment of extreme danger, she was offering cooperation instead of revenge, seeking to heal divisions rather than deepen them. Her courage went far beyond physical bravery. It was the courage to believe that even enemies could become allies if approached with wisdom and compassion. But Lord Roderick's sons were not ready to accept such possibilities. The younger son, Marcus, stepped forward with his own sword drawn. "Enough talk," he snarled. "Father, they're trying to manipulate you with false promises. Prince Alexander will never forgive what we've done here tonight. And Princess Elena will never abandon her destructive plans." Elena seized the moment of distraction to break free from Roderick's grip, spinning away from the dagger and toward Alexander in one fluid motion. The prince immediately moved to shield her with his own body, while his guards advanced on the Ashford men with weapons ready. But instead of ordering an attack, Alexander raised his hand to stop his soldiers. "Lord Roderick," the prince said calmly, "your son is wrong. I can forgive what happened here tonight, if you're willing to work with us toward a better future for Valdoria. Elena's offer of cooperation is genuine. We need experienced leaders to help guide the changes that are coming, whether we initiate them or not." The old lord looked around the great hall, taking in the faces of Alexander's soldiers, the determined expression on Elena's face, and the conflicted looks on his own sons' faces. The weight of decision pressed down on him, and he realized that the choices made in this room would determine not only his family's fate, but the future direction of the entire kingdom. "And if I refuse?" Roderick asked quietly. "If I choose to continue opposing your reforms and your vision for Valdoria's future?" Alexander's expression grew serious, but not vindictive. "Then you'll face trial for kidnapping and conspiracy against the crown. But more importantly, you'll miss the opportunity to help shape the changes that are coming. The old ways are ending, my lord, whether you help us create better ones or not." Elena stepped forward, her hand reaching out toward Roderick in a gesture of reconciliation. "Please," she said simply, "help us create a kingdom where your grandchildren can thrive alongside the children of farmers and merchants. Help us build something that preserves the best of tradition while embracing the justice that our people deserve." For a long moment, the great hall was silent, except for the crackling of torches and the distant sounds of fighting in the courtyard. Then, slowly, Lord Roderick lowered his dagger and nodded to his sons to do the same. The decision was made not through force or intimidation, but through the recognition that Elena and Alexander offered a path forward that might preserve both stability and justice. "I will consider your proposal," Roderick said formally, "but I want assurances that the noble families will have meaningful input into how these reforms are implemented. We cannot simply abandon overnight systems that have taken centuries to develop." Alexander nodded, relief evident in his voice. "Of course, the changes we envision will require the wisdom and experience of leaders throughout the kingdom. Elena and I have never intended to impose our will without consultation and collaboration." Elena moved to Alexander's side, taking his hand and feeling the tension finally begin to leave her body. The immediate danger was over, but she knew that the real work was just beginning, building trust between former enemies, crafting reforms that served justice without destroying stability, creating a kingdom that honored both tradition and progress. These challenges would require everything they had learned about leadership, diplomacy, and love. As dawn broke over the eastern mountains, Alexander and Elena stood together in the manor's courtyard, surrounded by soldiers and nobles who were beginning the difficult process of transformation from enemies to allies. The battle for Valdoria's future had been won not through conquest, but through the courage to offer hope instead of hatred, cooperation instead of domination. In the weeks that followed, Queen Isabel remained confined to her chambers, gradually coming to understand how badly she had misjudged both Alexander's character and the kingdom's need for change. Lord Roderick and his family did indeed become valuable advisors in implementing Elena's reforms, helping to ensure that progress served all of Valdoria's people, rather than destroying the structures that had provided stability. And in the palace at Valdoria, Prince Alexander and Princess Elena continued their work of building a kingdom worthy of the dreams they shared, knowing that their love had been tested by betrayal and emerged stronger than ever. The crown's greatest strength, they had learned, came not from the power to command, but from the wisdom to unite people around shared hopes for a better future. The palace would never again shake with anger and betrayal, but rather with the sounds of children learning in new schools, families celebrating improved harvests, and nobles and commoners working together to create the justice that Elena and Alexander had risked everything to achieve.